I want to welcome you to our first round table to continue these kinds of conversations and discussions. This one is titled Across the Waves, Ukrainian Canadians on Identity and Community Belonging. In 2000, renowned Canadian sociologist Vsevolod Isagiou interviewed 304 individuals in the Toronto area from amongst those who had arrived in Canada from Ukraine since 1991. Based on the answers received, Isagiou concluded that over the course of 10 years, new arrivals had not linked up with the Hromada, the established Ukrainian community, in any significant way. Newcomer attendance at activities sponsored by Ukrainian organizations was rated at 8% very often, 23.7% from time to time, 20.1% rarely, and a whopping 48.2% as never. Even informally, new immigrants have maintained a certain social distance from local Ukrainian Canadians. Less than 27% agreed or strongly agreed that it was easy to make friends with Ukrainian Canadians, compared to just over 41% for making friends with non-Ukrainian Canadians. So where are we in 2023, 20 years later? How integrated are the representatives of the post-1991 immigration and their children with the established Ukrainian community in Canada? What sense of identity have they been sustaining for themselves while in Canada, and how does this identity compare to the identity of members and descendants of previous immigration waves? So let's now think about our own experiences. In this roundtable, we have representatives of the post-1991 immigration wave and descendants of earlier Ukrainian immigration waves. They will analyze their diverse personal experiences of relating and belonging, while also considering broader historical and cultural contexts of their life paths and what it means to be Ukrainian Canadian. They'll share their informed perspectives on such questions and how they're contributing to the meta story of ever-changing Ukrainian identities in Canada. Representing the first wave pioneers, we have Victoria Kostyniuk, an MA candidate in the Department of Modern Languages and Cultural Studies at the University of Alberta. Representing post-World War II wave is Dr. Petryshyn. Roman has worn many hats in both government and academia, including the establishment in 1986 of the Office of Multiculturalism and Native Programming at Grant MacEwan Community College, as well as his later founding role and role of director of the Ukrainian Resource and Development Center at what is now MacEwan University in Edmonton. And then we have, representing post-1991 generation, 4 individuals: Natalia Khanenko-Friesen, the director of Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies and professor and Hutzulak Chair in Ukrainian Cultural and Ethnography at University of Alberta. Maria Lesiu, who presented a fantastic paper yesterday, is the associate professor of folklore at Memorial University in Newfoundland. Dr. Alexander Pankeyev is the research coordinator at CIUS and editor-in-chief of Forum for Ukrainian Studies with the Contemporary Ukrainian Studies program at CIUS. And Dmytro Yesipenko, PhD student in the Department of Modern Languages and Cultural Studies Department at the University of Alberta, as well as research assistant at the Cool Folklore Center. So welcome to all of our speakers. In this first round, I will ask you to reflect on these questions. The questions that I want to ask you are this: what does it mean for you to be a Ukrainian in Canada? And then maybe reflect on what aspects of Ukrainian culture, tradition, and history do you identify with the most? So to start it off, I'd like this to go according to the waves, and we'll start with you, Victoria.
It was only a number of years ago that I was able to identify as a Ukrainian Canadian based on Ukrainian Canadian culture being its own entity. I grew up with lots of friends who were Ukrainian friends who were first and second generation, and I always felt like I wasn't Ukrainian enough because I didn't speak Ukrainian at home with my family. We did things differently, and it was only really a few years ago when I started learning more and studying Ukrainian Canadian immigration through an academic lens that I was able to take what I learned and apply that to my own family history and the stories that I was told growing up, and really look at how unique Ukrainian Canadian culture is. Not only do I have traditions that my family brought with them from Ukraine, but also traditions and ways of doing things that are very specific to the first wave of Ukrainian immigration to Canada. And as well, I am able to bring new Ukrainian traditions back to my family. I think that being a Ukrainian in Canada, well, I can only really speak to being a Ukrainian in Alberta. I'm not very experienced with the other provinces. But, to go to a grocery store, you can find pierogies or vareniki, some kind of Ukrainian-style sausage, sometimes cabbage rolls, nalistniki, that kind of thing. So many of my non-Ukrainian friends are also familiar with that. And I think that is very unique to Canada, saying that, okay, I go to a Ukrainian church, whether it's Catholic or Orthodox, so many people are able to identify that with being the church with the big dome. Even the likelihood of meeting a stranger on the street, having them being able to identify something that is Ukrainian, in Edmonton anyways, is very likely that, they can relate something with you. When my great-grandparents first came to Canada, they were discriminated against. I found out 5 years ago that my great-great-grandfather was put in an internment camp. They were not treated properly by the rest of Canadians. And even my own father, I didn't know until a couple of years ago that even in the 1960s, he was called a bohunk by different people. And so comparing then, even in 1960 to now, I think just the attitude towards Ukrainian Canadians has changed so much. But I think also, as a descendant of the first wave of immigration, I need to respect and acknowledge the difficulties that they went through in order to have a lovely Ukrainian community here today.
Well, I have a short answer and a little longer answer to explain it. The short answer to my identity is with my parents. My parents were displaced people after World War II who lived in camps in Germany until 1949 and then immigrated to northern Ontario. So my parents were born after World War I in Western Ukraine, Halachina. That was a period of growth of national consciousness in the Ukrainian population after having lost independence during World War I. So in the 1920s and in the 1930s, my parents, who were young people at the time, became very politically active. As the Red Army occupied Ukraine at the end of the war with hundreds of thousands of immigrants, they walked through to Slovakia and on to Germany, where I was born in 1946 as a displaced person. And then from there, through sponsorship of people who were in Canada, we emigrated to Fort William, which has become Thunder Bay, for those of you who know, at the head of Lake Superior. So I attended Ukrainian language Saturday schools, went to Greco-Catholic church on Sunday, learned about Ukrainian politics and how to become active, really by listening to war stories at the kitchen table. Over the period 1950 to 1970, before I left home, I heard stories after stories, decade after decade, and that led to a substantial understanding of the third wave of immigration and the complexity of that wave, the political structure of that wave. And it actually, when I was first employed at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies in 1976, the first project I did was to produce a report on the emigre political parties that exist in the displaced person in the third wave, so that the full range from extreme right to extreme left are parties that I was familiar with in the leadership of the political parties and aware that such a structure existed in the third wave of immigration. As I heard these things, I didn't know whether these were true stories or not. And so by the age of 20, I began to believe these ideas, this information. I had verified the things I had heard. I had done a lot of reading. And I decided that I was going to maintain the values of my parents, modernize them, but I was going to keep the faith with the great struggle for Ukraine's independence, which seemed fairly hopeless, of course, through the Cold War period. In the 1960s, I went on to university, left high school. I was part of an entire generational movement that was created by the Vietnam War. And so in the course of the Vietnamese War, there was a mass mobilization of young people in the United States and, of course, in Canada. I had to reconcile the learning I had from my home environment and to reconcile it with the English-speaking public environment. And having decided that where I stood politically and in terms of research and educationally, I found methods to interpret Eastern Europe to the Canadian audience. And this led me to carry Ukrainian issues into the general movements of Canadian society. Some of you may or may not know, but of the wave of immigration that I'm in the third wave. My parents being the first generation, I'm the second generation. So I'm wave 3, generation 2. There were about 10,000 young people born in that wave. I think about 3,500 of them actually went through the Ukrainian community system that the third wave delivered. In other words, the Ukrainian schools were created, activated. They went to church, they went to Place Sum. In my town, there was no Place or Sum until the 60s, so I was a member of MUNO. While the older generation talked about the war, I began to identify with people like Senator Yuzek and others in the MUNO experience, and his ideas on multiculturalism became very interesting for me, and I became active in the multicultural movement, which led me to champion the cause with governments. I worked for the federal government, 2 provincial governments in cultural policies, and eventually these ideas were noticed by Professor Manoli Lupul, who wanted to create an institute at the University of Alberta called the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. So I and Bogdan Kravchenko were the first 2 sort of student activists that were hired to create the Canadian Institute along with Professor Lupul, who was a champion of multiculturalism. I encourage you all to read his book, to realize how these institutions in the public life came to be. Because when I was younger, the Ukrainian community was under church basements. You met at a church or you met at a hall. You never met in public institutions. You didn't go to the library, to have a meeting, or Edmonton Library, or certainly you never went to the University of Alberta for a conference. This was unheard of in the 1950s or 1960s. The Ukrainian community was a privatized community, but we've entered public life in the late 60s and 1970s. And so today we have not only the Institute, we have the Heritage Village outside of Edmonton, which is a provincial site. We have the bilingual program. We have the Ukrainian Center at MacEwan University. These are all consequence of the multicultural idea that I was activated on. And then I found it possible to create a career and work in the field. And that's another story, though.
Дякую, Романе. What that third wave built was something that I believe that's what I got to grow up in. Natalia, why don't you start us off with the post-1991 experience?
Thank you very much for the brief excursions into personal past, Victoria and Roman. Are entering a different story. We are beginning the post-1991 immigration in Canada. I arrived to Canada on a blizzardy, lovely August 26th of 1992, just a year after Ukraine gained its independence. I have come to study. I am definitely not very representative in terms of other immigrants who may have come after me or before me in uplifting in search of some better economic life. I've come to study. But I also wanted maybe hide behind the identity of we when reflecting on my own positionality vis-a-vis the topic of our today's conversation. I have come from the capital of Kyiv, and maybe at a time the community, established community in Canada, did not expect Kyivites to be Ukrainians. But there were some of us who were. I find myself belonging, and reflectively I recognize that I did belong to a very active group of student activists. I've been active in the revolution in the Granite, if you remember, there was one. Obviously, being in capital of Ukraine, we were in a way privileged to be in proximity to all the political movements of the time. So I've tremendously benefited from it, and my personal Ukrainian identity is definitely rooted in this political activism. Whether I was very politically active or not, that's a separate story. And not so in my personal familial upbringings and generational experiences of my own family. I wanted also to bracket our experience of us so-called post-1991ers. And by the way, you may have noted we're not using the numbered waves here, at least I'm not using it. I have this privilege of 30 years of reflection of time frame to be here in Canada. And looking back, I can call myself as an early post-1991er, like so few of us rather than many of us. And that's actually an important point. The critical mass wasn't there. We've come in numbers. We didn't come as communities, as cohorts. Therefore, our exposure to Ukrainian Canadian culture was also unique, and we were much more predisposed maybe to learn and get more integrated, at least how I perceive that being of my case. So we didn't constitute critical mass, significant critical mass. We also came directly from Ukraine. At that time, in the early 90s, hardly any of us had experience living in other countries, perhaps a bit of traveling, but not like you have encountered we will hear about that later, hopefully, with subsequent immigrations. Also, frankly, in the early 90s, despite the fact that I really wanted to learn as much as I could about Ukrainian Canadians, I was extremely ignorant because we couldn't access this information. We couldn't really learn much. So I've come with a very little knowledge about Ukrainians in Canada, but I also brought with myself lots of curiosity. And I suspect there was also on the other side, on the receiving side, there was lots of curiosity vis-a-vis us coming onto this continent. So in terms of my Ukrainian identity, and obviously Alla has mentioned before how much we all are engaged in these projects of constant negotiation on who we are vis-a-vis various settings, I certainly would point out that the experience of culture shock, which most of us lived through, informed our perspective on Ukrainian Canadians. And for me personally, most profound experiences from that time was discoveries of civic engagement that USS, Ukrainian Student Club, for example, was teaching me. Again, coming from the Soviet times, being completely, disliking strongly, let me dreading the meetings and official gatherings which would be institutionalized and sort of extensions of various official organizations in our youth in Ukraine. These would be Communist Party meetings, Komsomol meetings. We never liked those meetings. So I was quite dreading my first encounter with USS. AGM. I still remember the room in which I was with such a memorable experience. I still remember that sense of discovery and shock I lived through in terms of how active students were, what they wanted to do. The other point, the very last one, which I wanted to, just two more. Personally, what I also absolutely loved, and you're one of those reasons, Ramon, is I remember being completely affected by that shock again, that I could make friends with elderly people here in Canada. And Bogdan Medvitsky certainly is to blame for that. He was very capable of finding for us newcomers some, community established activists who were way in sort of 3 generations above me, I felt at the time. And yet our relationships were meaningful. Ivan and Lilian, for example, were not treating me as a grandchild, but rather we were peers. So it was also very shocking to learn more about Ukrainian Canadian community, that age doesn't matter, the activism doesn't matter, that agency can be ageless. In terms of my personal evolutionary growth, I would just simply briefly mention that being from central Ukraine, not only I was somewhat, I was ignorant of Ukrainian Canadian culture, but I also were not processing through myself the whole cultural legacy and history of Western Ukrainian lands, Western Ukrainian people. That has come to me in Canada. I have certainly built into myself that cultural heritage of Western Ukrainian history, and I truly are recognizing that it's to be part of me. And lastly, prairies. Vic, you were mentioning you were coming from the prairies. I'm proudly saying I'm a prairie person as well. Immigration-wise, diaspora studies-wise, having lived here 30 years, having built family on the prairies, having traveled and having done my research in the prairies, can I call myself a prairie folk, please? Did I earn the right? So those are the points I wanted to make.
This conference, we talked about dynamism, change, and intersectionality. We all have multiple identities, and we operate within many groups and many communities, and ethnicity is only one identity marker through which we identify. And it's situational and contextual, and it has been very dynamic for me in Canada. And when I think about the ways we identify and build groups and senses of belonging in multiple ways, I often think that, you know what, I feel indeed more connected to my non-Ukrainian colleagues sometimes through our professional ties and interests than I would feel to some of my Ukrainian counterparts that just arrived from Ukraine. So this is all normal. We experience those kinds of things. Having said that, ethnicity is still a big factor in my personal life because of who I am. I think it was Yulia yesterday who correctly pointed out that we often don't reflect on our ethnic identity until we encounter an other. I was born and raised in Western Ukraine, and even though my parents are city dwellers, we always maintained strong ties and strong connections with village culture through my grandparents. So when I relocated to Edmonton in 2003 and became part of the Ukrainian community both culturally and professionally, even though everything was contextually different, it felt so familiar, it felt so comfortable. I was a Ukrainian speaker, and I could easily and unproblematically kind of identify with prairie culture in this part of Canada, and identify with what Ukrainian Canadian sociologists labeled visible symbols. As Natalia correctly pointed out, they come from the village culture of Western Ukraine. So all of that was very familiar, very comfortable, and I felt like I fit. Admittedly, I also took the Ukrainian diaspora project in Canada, in Western Canada, for granted, right? It's sort of, okay, of course it's like this in Canada. Of course it's familiar because, you know, there are many Ukrainians in Canada. And then I moved to Newfoundland. When you are relocated to a place where, you know, all Ukrainians live in your house, you look at yourself differently. And this is where it was in Newfoundland when I developed this true admiration and true appreciation for the Ukrainian diaspora project, for that kind of enormous investment by multiple generations and waves of immigration that was made by Ukrainian Canadians. And I stopped taking the diaspora project for granted. So despite some cultural challenges that I experienced in Newfoundland, it was a very healthy move for me, professionally speaking. I knew that I had to teach general folklore classes, no Ukrainian content, nobody would care, nobody would register in those. However, at the same time, most of my research initiatives and research projects were connected either with Ukraine or the Ukrainian diaspora, and it's natural for every teacher to incorporate their research materials into their lectures, into their teaching, and so did I. I had to learn how to speak to people who don't know and don't care. And many of my students prior to the full-scale war wouldn't really identify Ukraine easily and unproblematically on the map of the world, and I had to learn. So I had to broaden my horizons and learn how how to talk about Ukrainian experiences, which are complex and diverse on their own, to people who didn't have that background and that knowledge. So I had to expand my research questions and address concepts like place, belonging, or Canada, or globalization, and how we can understand those through Ukrainian experiences to make it more or less relatable to my students. Also, because Newfoundland is such a small place, I often ended up being under the same roof with different kinds of people, including those from Ukraine. And these experiences made me think about some of the questions that Oля and Masha raised yesterday: who belongs and who doesn't. I met many people who wouldn't easily fit some of the more conservative circles of the Ukrainian diaspora, and I started thinking about those questions of belonging more broadly, but I will address them in response to the next question. Thank you.
Just before our preparation, I was joking that it is going to be a group therapy. That we discussed what we are planning, what we are actually ready to reveal about ourselves, about our identities. So, and I think that already we are actually having some shape. In terms of my positionality and my identities, and to tell the story of my integration and my knowledge about the Ukrainian community here in Canada, I need to start a little bit earlier also. So with the time when I was still in Ukraine. 1991, it's the time when Ukraine regained its independence. But it is also the time actually when I started my first grade at school. It means that actually I was growing together with Ukraine. And that process actually left all marks on my identity. So all turmoils, all problems that Ukraine has had since its independence, so I can relate. So this transitional period that Ukraine experienced with revolutions, with the war, with all kind of political and other problems. So everything is actually right now ingrained in my identity. But also I need to reveal where I'm from, because what we are hearing right now is just only one part of Ukraine. But I'm coming from the part of Ukraine that is right now and before is a little bit stigmatized and a little bit narrated in different narrations, like pro-Russian, like Russophone. But I spent like half of my childhood just between Zaporizhia and Kharkiv region, but I am Ukrainian speaker. It is something what shocks many people, how it is actually possible. But in my family, and especially in my village was fully Ukrainian speaking. So it's something what actually, but being in that region actually adds different layers that you have to negotiate. And just moving within Ukraine, just moving to Kyiv, it also adds something. But when you actually go and actually have the chance to interact with different people. And I'm talking right now about my first encounter with Ukrainian Canadian culture. It was 2011, when I had just for 6 months visited Canada, being invited by the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies as a visiting researcher. So I just barely touched the surface, and I can describe that my first six months here and experience that it was mostly experience of commodified Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian Canadian culture. So just pierogies, all kind of festivals, community halls, but I didn't know actually how this community is living. But when actually decided and the decision was made actually to immigrate and settled in Canada, it was 2013. And we know what happened in 2013. It's Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine. It's really traumatic experience. I'm really grateful to the community with which actually my integration to the Ukrainian community happened. It's actually first like third wave. I actually had many connections with third wave, and we already mentioned Bogdan Medvitsky, his influence because he actually introduced me to many of kind kind of institution that we have. Also that we have, yeah, the 1 minute. And my first encounter with the organized Ukrainian community was not really good one. I need to thank, first of all, to Roman Petryshyn and Olenka Pilash. You are actually those people who I admire, and also who actually inspired me to become, I think, the leader in the Ukrainian community right now. But at that moment, you initiated the research project, Euromaidan research project. And why you actually became aware of the guy who actually organized the Euromaidan in Edmonton. And I had some problems with this, because I didn't know that it is something what actually should be organized by the Center of Cook. And I was contacted. I was actually ashamed that I actually had to overstep all of these institutions. But actually, that learning curve that I had, I right now really feel that Ukrainian community, that we have that diversity, and I'm still learning and trying to figure out where is the positionality of all kind of generations and waves we have right now here. Thank you.
Once again, I'm representative of academic wave post 1991. I came from Kyiv, from capital, 2 years ago. And unlike many persons who came here to Edmonton, I knew no one. I had only few email contacts. And our choice, I mean, my family choice and my choice of Edmonton was in particular because of the large Ukrainian community, and also what is important for me, academic community, because I knew at that time about institutions, about Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, other associations and institutions, and for me as a person working in Ukrainian studies, it was important to have also this community. So my answer to the question, what does it mean to be Ukrainian in Canada, is actually answer to the question, what does it mean to be Ukrainian in Ukrainian studies in Canada, and also an answer to the question, what does it mean to be Ukrainian in Canada now during the ongoing war. This connection to academic community was, as I said, the reason for the choice, and it's actually a tricky moment because as a Ukrainian working in this field, in Ukrainian studies broadly defined, first, it's plus because you are always interested. It's your modus vivendi. You don't need to force yourself to be interested in Ukraine. It's just the way you lived, the way you live every day because you're interested in the news, interested in learning new about not only history of Ukraine but also what's going on now in Ukraine. From other point of view, it's minus because you yourself you are aware that you might be subjective. You might have predispositions, biases about particular views, about particular understandings of Ukraine because you are Ukrainian, you cannot be objective. This is relevant always, this was relevant before the end of February 2022. That event, I believe, changed a lot. And now being a Ukrainian in Canada, for me, it's a little bit like schizophrenic, I might say, because it's a double life. You know, when you have very simple question, how are you doing? How are you doing? Like, what's going on? I have two answers to this question. First one is short and simple. It's everything is fine, everything is okay. Maybe it's like a few details about what's like some local details, what's happening in my academic life, in my professional life, of my family. But the other answer is a longer one. I need to be sure that the person actually is prepared to hear this answer. And this is my answer about concerns, about my thoughts related to Ukraine, what's happening now, and to very particular people in Ukraine, from my family, from our friends. It's a huge part of daily life, of weekly life, thinking and doing what I can, communicating with people in order to help them, especially during the last year, but also now. We all knew what does it mean, like volunteering activities. It's hard to be far from Ukraine. I understand why I'm here, what is the reasons, but from other point of view, it's psychologically pretty hard, I must say. Coming back to the beginning to one of the actual questions you mentioned about what part of the culture we identified the most, associate ourselves the most. I believe for me it's triad. It's Ukrainian language for sure. Ukrainian history, including history that is being created on our eyes as we see it, and also my professional interest, Ukrainian literature. So this is the triad. Thank you.
It's interesting. I'm going to reflect on something Olenka had said before. She made the comment of the only way to overcome challenges is to first have awareness. And we talked about there being a rift sometimes between whether it be generations or waves of Ukrainians, however we want to refer to it. My next set of questions are these. Is there anything that can unite and bring together all of the diverse waves and generations of Ukrainian Canadians? And in your opinion, what is the future of Ukrainian identity in Canada, and what will be its pillars? And I know this is a little bit tough because we're a little bit in a bubble here in terms of as academics studying Ukrainian studies, and we're quite open to a lot of these things. But putting ourselves into understanding that outside these walls, that rift really does exist. So if you can kind of think about those questions, and we'll get started.
I want to share the framework that I used in my own work. And as has been the case for over 100 years with the Ukrainian community in Canada, identities have two distinct dimensions. A diaspora dimension, which is part of a global Ukrainian identity focused on Ukraine, applicable mostly to the first and second generations, and an ethnic dimension. So I'm distinguishing the two. And the ethnic dimension, which is part of Canadian multiculturalism and is originally meant to be for Ukrainian Canadians in the 1970s and 80s, applicable to the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth generation of each wave. I'm distinguishing 6 waves, and we have now certainly 5 or 6 generations in each of these waves. Verbecker suggests there are 3 core elements that form a diaspora. One is a traumatic or voluntary dispersal across states. And secondly, an orientation to a real or imagined homeland. And thirdly, boundary maintenance, which is mobilized and maintained through group solidarity. So this concept of diaspora applies already to waves, less so to wave 1 in my view, but starting with wave 2 through 4, we can see diasporan components to the Ukrainian community. So based on the current situation, I'd argue that what we're seeing is an organized community acting as a diaspora by and large because of the war in Ukraine. An unprecedented level of cooperation exists both internally in Canada among community leaders of churches, emigre political parties, educators, artists, writers, and externally with the UN, the G7, NATO, the European Union, international. This is unprecedented in the history of Ukraine and Ukrainian Canadians. That doesn't mean that all of the people who comprise the 1.4 million people who answered the census as having a Ukrainian element in their ethnic identity. Not all of them are involved in this process, but the authoritative leaders of the churches and other organizational structures are more united on some specific issues and actions ever before. Now, unlike in third wave of the diaspora, where we were excluded from contact politically with Soviet Ukraine, waves 5 and 6 have a welcoming connection to their own government in Ukraine. And it's also facilitated by low-cost digital and air flight communication. So after a period of 5 to 10 years, I'm expecting that this QET, the current wave of families who are in Canada, will also develop leadership that will organize themselves as a diaspora due to their common current war trauma experience. Very similar to that of the third wave and that of the second wave. All 3 are war trauma waves of immigration. However, unlike the second and third wave, which had their own emigre political parties fighting for independence, Ukraine's oligarchic political parties have not succeeded in creating party political supporters in Canada at this point. It was very common in the 1950s and 1960s inside the Ukrainian community to have banderівці, мельниківці, гетьманці. We do not have a Poroshenko group, or, although they visited, they have been here and so on, but they have not been particularly successful in organizing because of the nature of the Ukrainian community today is different. And there is an independent Ukraine, which is what the Ukrainian Canadians were all about, is the independence of a state, not necessarily of a political party. That's a difference. So once Ukraine wins this war and begins to rebuild, I think we will, of course, see something along the lines that Israel saw after its creation. That is, diasporas who had struggled for independence will convert to building a diaspora that is helping to build institutions in Ukraine. And as is the relationship between Israelis and Jewish diaspora, the relationships will not necessarily, they'll be solid on the question of the independence of Israel and the independence of Ukraine. But there will be many, many differences articulated in the future between Ukrainian Canadians and the governments of Ukraine. There has always been, in the Greek diaspora, other diasporas, a falling out between the national government and the diaspora in the West. More and more, I think in the future, Ukrainian Canadians will relate to Ukraine through their governments, through the government of Canada, through provincial governments, the various ministries, trade, and so on, rather than through private organizations. There will be a strong basis for Canada-Ukraine relations to develop an international trade, military arrangements, contracts among educators, spiritual leaders, artists. All of that interaction will be done, but at a professional level. Now, the impact of Canadian culture will grow in the future in Ukraine itself. So unlike French Canadians, Anglo-Canadians, and Indigenous Canadians, Ukrainian Canadians do not have a charter status in Canadian society. We will not likely see the emergence of a Commonwealth relationship the way Canada has with Britain, or a francophonie relationship as Quebec has with France, or Indigenous international information. I can comment about that.
I had something else, kind of other thoughts prepared, but looking at the first wave of immigration to the current wave with the CU-AET visa, for myself, the biggest difference that I've noticed is the level of welcomeness from Canadians. When my great-grandparents came over, Canadians were not welcoming to them. When my grandparents were going to school, they were punished for speaking Ukrainian. Only a few years ago, I found out that my Baba is actually fluent in Ukrainian. I had absolutely no idea, but she was told by her 12 older siblings, don't speak Ukrainian at school because you will get in trouble. And so my Nana and Guido made the decision not to speak Ukrainian at home with my father. Their identity of being Ukrainian was somewhat shameful, from what I understand, whereas during this wave, we see everyday Canadians opening their homes and welcoming people. Yes, the waves are different situations. The attitude of Canadians is so very different. So a difference with the first wave trying to assimilate to the Canadian culture, whereas with the most recent wave, I've spoken to newcomers and they say, oh no, I want my children to only speak Ukrainian at home. Like, we don't want them to become too integrated, where it was kind of the opposite situation earlier on, which I think is very unique. As Ukrainian Canadian culture in general, it will continue to shift. I mean, we've seen so many shifts in the last 100-some years. It'll revitalize itself. I've noticed with other, say, great-grandchildren of first-wave immigrants trying to connect more with their Ukrainian roots. again, that kind of pendulum of having been told not to embrace their Ukrainian culture, and now with more waves coming, immigrants bringing their traditions, people from kind of my situation are relating more to them and hoping to incorporate these traditions in their own lives.
I'd like to introduce sort of a timeline and a time vector to our conversation. And coming back to the question if there's anything that can bring and unite us together across different waves and generations. I think, Roman, you were already doing that. We are very much puzzled by the ongoing interactions and perhaps tensions and conversations and dialogues that are persistent from one locus to another. School cases, for example, we've heard were quite illustrative in that sense. Communities and waves have come together before, especially in the light of crises and challenges which the homeland, that so-called ethnic homeland, has been facing. Think about the responses to the Holodomor, think about World War II, think about Soviet occupation of Western Ukraine, political persecutions of Ukrainian dissidents in the 70s, think about current war in Ukraine and geopolitical crisis altogether. So in times of crisis in the homeland, ethnic homeland, as all diaspora studies scholars know, these are the times when differences are put aside and communities are mobilizing to come as a shared front to support the homeland. But I wanted also to go back to the differences between that, perhaps at least my positionality is I'm setting myself aside from you. I'm an early post-1991er. And at the time that immigration was taking place, it had a very different orientation than previous immigrations had. Over the course of 20th century, especially perhaps with the exception of first wave, Ukrainians were leaving their homelands, and plural, still located within the boundaries of one empire or the other, or even later within the boundaries of a totalitarian state of Soviet Union. The orientation, that mental direction towards rescuing, saving, maintaining Ukrainian identity elsewhere, because in Ukraine it wasn't possible, was one of the leading causes for the community to sustain itself elsewhere. That's sort of a vector was dual, from homeland to the diaspora, from diaspora to homeland. That what sort of mutual interest was defined by the sort of a one line, if you wish, from point A to point B and the other way around. But when Soviet Union collapsed, and suddenly the world became available to all of us at the time, my generation of post-1991ers wanted to embrace the world, wanted to discover it and what it had to offer to all of us. So the immigration, on top, of course, of dealing with necessity to sustain itself economically, because for sociologists, this is the drive, this is what brings it together. It comes also with this interest in the world, interest in Canada, and that also sets this immigration aside, and that, I think, also introduced reasons why the incongruency between the previous community and the new community in the 90s at least was quite noticeable. So that focus on the world for the first time and not on Ukraine would also explained for a while the difference. But of course then we moved into the 2000s, those revolutions, the orange one, then the Maidan and so on and so forth in the war now, have put that aside, and we have left our agendas, individual agendas, community agendas, and we've come together again. With respect to that very challenging and very loaded question of what can be the future of Ukrainian identity in Canada, I can't offer the answer for a number of reasons. Conceptually and intellectually, we have been for a while struggling with the framework which we use to describe and explain diasporic communities and evolutions of diasporic communities. I'm an anthropologist. I am trained also in the ethnography, and I am not fully agreeing with Roman, for example, that institutional links will dominate. People have so many other means to maintain and sustain connections, and we've been living it personally. But ultimately, beginning with all of those important revolutions in communication, technical changes we have seen in the media, in travel, which we've been all commenting since the 90s in our respective scholarships, as we've watched and commented on globalization, deterritorialization. I've been always struggling to say that word. These were the processes which also introduced possibilities for diversification, dilution of identities, introduction of all possibilities for subcultures to emerge and create and exist and coexist with our kind of core ethnic identities, if you wish. So ultimately, I think going forward, are we really positioned or are well helped by or assisted by these very notions we've been relying on as waves, immigrations, generations to understand how our identity in Canada would evolve? I don't have an answer. Maybe my colleagues will have something to add to that. My point is that instead of that sort of a univectoredness of relationships between the homeland on one end and diaspora on the other end, in my scholarship, I have been arguing for a long time that we are in far, not even now, not in 2022, but in the late 1800s, Ukrainians moved on and started living globally. So Ukrainian culture is not diasporic culture, it's not culture which of homeland, it's a global culture. It had been this way in smaller ways since the end of the 19th century, and my ethnographic work and my research work confirmed, or at least I was fascinated by my own discoveries, reading about trajectories of villages and peasants in the 19th century, traveling over the world and connecting with homelands and moving on to new locations to live and build their lives, ultimately covering, by their trajectories, covering large terrains. And it is especially is the case right now. We know we are accepting so many newcomers here, and many of them have come after living for decades elsewhere. So ultimately, I'm keen to hear what my other colleagues have to say about these very important questions. Thank you.
I would like to start answering it with a question, what is Ukrainian? If we think about it, if we pause for a second, what is Ukrainian? Who belongs, who doesn't? What makes a person Ukrainian? To partially answer this, I would like to share three what I call ethnographic snapshots. My personal encounters that have happened over the last year. About 2 or 3 months into the war, a Jewish Canadian-born colleague came up to me and said, Maria, a Ukrainian woman started coming to our synagogue, but I cannot tell you much about her because she doesn't speak a word of English. I don't even know if she speaks Russian or Ukrainian. Do you mind if I share your phone number with her? And I said, yes, of course. And I jokingly say it to my Jewish colleague often. I say, I keep telling you, Ukrainian Jews are my people, not your people. My second example, an acquaintance in St. John's is from Eastern Ukraine. She's a Russian speaker. In fact, she tries to speak Ukrainian sometimes, but keeps apologizing for it, doesn't feel comfortable speaking Ukrainian. It's not her comfort zone. That woman has put a tremendous amount of effort into helping all sorts of Ukrainian causes since the full-scale war started. And that woman's father is a Ukrainian army general who's been at the front line for over the last year or so. And my third example, Alla, this one is for you actually. When the province of Newfoundland and Labrador sponsored the first plane of Ukrainian migrants escaping the war, I agreed to translate for the immigration officers. And the majority of those newcomers were Russian speakers, like the great majority of them. Here I was seeing this elderly gentleman who was there by himself, introduced himself to me, needed some help with translation. He's a Crimean Tatar who is actually from Crimea and ended up in Kiev after the annexation of Crimea. He spoke fluent Ukrainian with me. He sounded, his Ukrainian was exactly the same as mine, and you would have never been able to tell that, he was a native speaker of Ukrainian. So when we talk about community building, it's about points of connection. It's about connecting and overcoming differences. So my personal take on how to move forward, I'm thinking, because I'm also an ethnographer, and I'm thinking about these small-scale encounters and our everyday life. And I'm thinking it would be good for us, well, at least I can speak for myself, to make like a mental exercise to expand those points of connection, to create as many of those as possible, to build this sense of community and expand our definition of Ukrainian as beyond some kind of established conservative definitions. It's a useful mental exercise. My personal example, the acquaintance that I just mentioned, the Russian speaker, I have to be very honest. My relationship with the Russian language has been problematic since last year. I try very hard. I do that mental exercise. I speak exclusively Russian to her. I have a deep appreciation for everything this woman is about and everything she does. Thank you.
We all know the classic notion of diaspora. It includes and also drives on the notion of homeland and ancestral lands. When it comes to the unity of all generations and past ways, I think what is happening right now in Ukraine, it is catalyst. It actually gives the additional moment when people can actually rediscover their roots and they can go and think about who they are. So it's something. So in my mind, so right now, I do not have all of these divisions like first, second wave. So for me, just right now, I see just only two probably before the escalation and what is going on right now after the escalation of the war. The narratives that I see that we are starting speaking about that how we can integrate those people who are arriving to Canada. I think it is early to start this, speaking about the integration of them into Ukrainian community here, because they have their problems and they have to process them. And yesterday, Yulia Ivanyuk actually presented the excellent case about the scholars, how they are actually feeling the guilt about that they are here in Canada, that they actually left their family back in Ukraine, and that narrative that we are starting, many people starting them actually applying, how you actually can become the members of larger Ukrainian community here, I think it is traumatizing. It is traumatizing and it needs time. And especially when how we actually call those people. The label that we actually apply, immigrants, newcomers, refugees, all of this. I think at this moment we need to start caring about how they actually feel, what they actually going through. Then probably after the situation in Ukraine is settled, we actually can start thinking about who wants actually to become a part of Ukrainian community. But it's also a really complicated question about the future of Ukrainian community that we have in mind, the future that we actually want to see of this community, how it will be developing. So because the number of people that are arriving right now from Ukraine and their priorities and their concerns are dramatically different from those who actually arrived after 1991 and also from those generations that actually settled earlier. And we need to keep this really seriously. Ukraine is independent, and Ukraine is developing also country right now really fast, even when it is war. So I'm just observing all kind of digital communication that right now is happening in different groups. The narrative of how Ukraine is actually better than Canada is actually amazing. That people who actually right now settled in Canada because of war, they're comparing Ukraine to what actually Ukraine was before 2022. Ukraine much developed in all kind of aspects. So we need to actually just maybe step a little bit like back and observe, and then maybe react, because those reactions that we are right now seeing that sometimes actually makes harm to those people.
When I read this question, previously I thought about this first when I was in Australia, in Melbourne. We had discussion what can unite people and bring them together, people who are interested in Ukraine, people of Ukrainian origin. Our idea was to organize film festival I believe it makes sense. It's like narrow understanding of this issue. It's about bringing people together in one physical space for pretty short period of time. Of course, they received like common experience, but it would be like very limited experience. The question, I believe, is about how to make people more connected, to put people in the situation when they want, but they can, and when more importantly, when they can share the experiences and also build plans about the future. And Victoria's story and Greco's story, they are unfortunately not unique, and that many stories when in Ukrainian families, because of different like reasons, this Ukrainian language was lost, and it was very hard to restore this knowledge in following generations. Now, an ongoing period of time, I believe it's very important to preserve connection, speaking about future, to preserve connection of people of younger generation, even younger than our generation. Alexander, for example, I'm speaking about teenagers, speaking about children, to preserve the connection with Ukrainian as such, for them not to be assimilated, because now parents, newcomers, they're speaking about maybe it's better way to enroll the child in the usual Canadian school. It will be easier to learn language. It will be easier to be successful. It's a dangerous idea because it's kind of similar to what was happening like 100 years ago, and we know the results of this. So I believe it's very important, like, not to lose opportunities to work with this very particular age group. Because of course, Ukrainian associations, they did a great job providing people opportunities in terms of accommodation, in terms of finding jobs. But this group, teenagers and children, like not that many. I'm not speaking now about Edmonton, but for example about Calgary. We want our children to go somewhere in summer to communicate with each other, Ukrainian children, Ukrainian and Canadian children, and we don't have these opportunities. So speaking about future, I believe it would be very practical result to have these programs, to continue and expand Ukrainian educational programs, bilingual programs, but not only that, to create the spaces, the opportunities where people can, when they can corroborate, because digital communication, it's something very different. I believe it's very important to have this living contact, especially after COVID times.
It's really fascinating, all of your different perspectives, and I like that idea of the points of connection, of observation, and creating some space to allow things to unfold. So we're going to open up the floor now and see if anyone has any questions to be able to continue this conversation.
I have a question about religion. In my understanding, the way I've been studying, thinking about the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada, this has been a cornerstone. The church, the difference of the church that it was, and the preservation of the culture. We saw in demographic presentation yesterday, people come without religion. So we have multiple religions. We also have a moving to the calendar that will be the same calendar as Canadian calendar. In some parts of our white Canada, having a different day was good because we could get together, like I'm from Nova Scotia, we would get together to have that Easter or have that Christmas on a different day than you have the family celebration on a Canadian Christmas, right? I'm just wondering what will happen to Ukrainian Canadians when all these things change, because I think the role of religion is very important to preserve the unity. So when I see diaspora, some of the National Film Board documentaries about 50s, Christmas, it's my Christmas, and I grew up in Ukraine, so I kind of can relate. And I see now that they don't relate, like many people don't relate.
I have a good answer from Newfoundland, not about what will, but what has been happening already. Because it's a small place with no Ukrainian priests, no Ukrainian churches, but all of a sudden 2,000 Ukrainians arrived. A Ukrainian Catholic priest and a Ukrainian Orthodox priest take turns, speak to each other. It's a beautiful ecumenical effort. Speak to each other, and they alternate weeks on which they arrive. They arrive once a month, but they make sure that their schedules do not conflict with one another. People who have been coming there, I haven't interviewed any of them. This is just my superficial observation, but many of them would be what some scholars of religion would call cultural Catholics. Catholic or cultural Orthodox, right? Коли не прийдемо в церкву, завжди Пасху святять. Many people have been coming to both services and both churches. Oh, and it was actually a local Anglican church who kindly gives its church for Ukrainian services on those particular days, for both for Catholics and for the Orthodox.
From my sort of post-1990s perspective, the fact that the post-1991ers were not particularly as religious as the previous waves have been, I don't think necessarily created any conflict in the community until the imposition of this geopolitical crisis on the recent idea of changing the calendar, because that right now we are now facing these conversations. Of course, in private conversations, I hear a lot of complaints. And that also is a parent who is trying to raise a child with Ukrainian traditions in a, how do you call these families? When my husband is not Ukrainian, so we do have this. You know, we have Canadian celebrations for some days reserved, and then there's the other ones. And I'm struggling to figure out what we will do, how we will reconcile that. So ultimately, I think it's a moving piece. We will see what will happen. And I'm actually looking at all my fellow academics. Will you please invite a PhD or master student focused on ethnography to do work on that ongoing situation? That will be good to resolve.
I'm described already, Natalia, that wave of immigration, we are not really religious. But when I immigrated to Canada, so I actually started appreciating all kind of actually religion expressions that Ukrainian community can offer, and the way how they can collaborate and work together. It's something what in Ukraine I couldn't experience, but here it's when we have different gatherings, we have community halls, we have like representatives from different Ukrainian churches. It's something what actually I started thinking about this as a community marker, not as a marker of actually religion. Here I see that it is a really important marker how Ukrainian community can preserve its cultural identity.
I'd like to certainly confirm that I believe in maximizing the diversity in our community, and I've written an article appearing in the next issue of Ukrainian News here in Edmonton about recognizing the potential for greater diversity inside the community. Typically, a wave of immigration after a period of time will shake itself out, and I'd like to just say a few words about what has been the experience over that 100 years. If we take a longer view, we begin to see that Canadian society will impact on the fifth and sixth generation in ways that you are maybe not aware that people can't be aware of it by looking at their experience in the short term. But as you begin to look at it in the long term, there are patterns of community organization, and so I'd like to speak to those institutions that emerge in Canadian society by drawing maybe briefly on the Ukrainian experience and reference maybe other communities from my multicultural experience. So first of all, we have to say that the Constitution of Canada does not recognize Ukrainians. The word Ukrainian is not mentioned in the Canadian Constitution, although the word Métis or Dene, these words are mentioned in the Canadian Constitution. So is the word French, and so is the word English as official languages. These are constraints or framework within which the Ukrainian Canadian community has to live and emerge. We are not a community that has a land base. The settlement of the 1890s and so on is dissipating. If you go to Two Hills and Mrandere today, the churches are not full with Ukrainian speakers. That land base, people have moved to the cities in Canada just as they did in Ukraine. And so in the cities, immigrant groups organize themselves as ethnic minorities. And there's only certain things that the law and the social practices of the country allow to exist on a sustained basis. Language, as you've seen the statistic, will not be sustained in Canada unless we have some kind of international air flights for our children to Ukraine where they can learn Ukrainian in Ukraine, because they will not be able to learn it in Canada, as 100 years has shown, if only 2% of the population speak Ukrainian. That's evidence of what's likely to happen with the fifth and sixth wave. The institutions that have survived, they are the churches. We have to understand that the churches are global institutions. The Ukrainian Catholic Church is obviously global, but so will be the Orthodox Church of Ukraine will begin to operate globally. It's already begun. Secondly, those churches are also economic institutions. They run institutions. For example, cemeteries. Cemeteries is a very good, big business with churches generally, and Ukrainian churches are in on that sector of the economy. The Ukrainian community, if you look at what has survived over 3 generations, over several waves, the churches have survived. Community and family foundations have emerged. They're very prevalent in the Jewish community, and they're now, in the last 30 years, prevalent in the Ukrainian community. The Khanenko Foundation, the Canada-Ukraine Foundation, the Ukrainian Catholic University Foundation of Canada in Canada is surviving and doing well. And then family foundations. Who is funding the Ukrainian community? It's a Timothy Family Foundation, the Ignatovich Family Foundation, and so on. Endowed centers at universities, I won't say more about them. National umbrella groups who have staff at the top of their churches. These are organizations like Союз Українських самостійників Канади, Українське національне об'єднання. These are organizations that have an ideology and have a men's group, a women's group, a children's group, a youth school, but they also own foundations and they own land. They own summer camps, the halls, and so on. They're surviving. Credit unions are still surviving, but have been consolidated. When I was a younger person, there were 36 Ukrainian credit unions in Canada. Today, there are perhaps a half a dozen major ones that they've consolidated. They have actually $1 billion worth of loans and so on. They are major institutions. Professional Ukrainian arts organizations, for example, Shumka. It is a professional group in the sense that they get an honoraria for the best dancer for dancing, but it's an organization which can mount international tours. They tour not only in Canada, but tour China, the Philippines, and so on. These groups are surviving. And I would say the heritage food industry survives. Soul food, we used to call it in the 60s, soul food. And the travel industry specializing in country of origin. All of these have been able to find the ways to generate funds. Money is at the heart of the Ukrainian community, just like it is in the rest of life. And we know that after several generations, and I'll just mention that through multiculturalism, we now fortunately have publicly funded bilingual schools, historic sites, and seniors' homes. With government funding, they will survive over the generations. In the long term, Canadian society has compelled the Ukrainian community, the Jewish community, the German community to organize itself in these ways institutionally. It's quite likely these kinds of organizations will also, not now, but in 20 years from now, will be of interest to the fifth and sixth wave of immigration.
It'll be an interesting thing to see, because I also know through my own community work and experiencing decline in a lot of the organizations. And so, like everything, there's all of these waves of things. You talk about government funding as money at the heart of it. We're experiencing now at the university the lack of government funding in order to keep our institutions going. I think going back to that whole increasing those points of connection, expanding on that, and building that awareness that Olenka mentioned, with the awareness of what our needs are and opening up to whatever wave is coming in, will make some changes and hopefully allow us to sustain ourselves. Some more questions.
I would say that I'm probably very involved in the church, in the Ukrainian Catholic Church in Edmonton. I worked with the Eparchy of Edmonton for a number of years, but my family is from Plain Lake area near Two Hills or Mundare. They would only have one service a year for the graveside blessings, and I remember I was probably 12 years old, and the church was practically empty. We were wondering, okay, are they going to close it down? And then we went just before COVID, and the church was packed. Like, absolutely, my family had to sit in the choir loft because there were no more pews left. And so we were wondering, what happened? Yes, the majority of those people don't speak Ukrainian, but they have connected kind of back to their roots, back to what their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents put that effort into create their church, their local gathering place. Going back to the calendar switch, my family, my mom isn't Ukrainian, but she says she became Ukrainian the day she got married. Christmas Eve, we celebrate on the 24th and 25th, but Christmas Eve has always been Sviat Večer, and having those traditions on English Christmas, and then on the 25th we have turkey or whatever. But then on January 6th, we still recognize that as being Ukrainian Christmas. And I don't think, if they change the official calendar, I personally can't see a switch going off and everybody just saying, okay, that's it, no more celebrating on the 6th or 7th.
As I listen to the presentations of academics, I also hear advocacy. Academics in many fields do not have to be advocates and academics. But I wonder if you feel in our field, if we do.
In my case, I feel it. We didn't read our introductions and biographies. It's first time actually when I listed all my affiliations with Ukrainian organizations here. I didn't have time to showcase it, but it's actually the juggling between your academic career and also community work. It's something what is a part of my integral, my identity right now, and I feel it. Sometimes actually it's a really difficult task because you sometimes have to be really harsh on both, on academics and also on your community. So just to explain and just to be the messenger and also that bridge between those two communities.
I'm thinking about, again, a professional hat I wear, and probably Maria wears as well, as trained anthropologists who are taught to do advocacy work in a careful, reflective way, delineating between identities and projects and intersections and tensions between those hats we wear. Obviously, as a director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, having come also from the background of community engaged scholar, as a founder of the first national journal of community engaged scholar, I think this is a direction for scholars to go.
Thank you very much for your insightful comments and sharing of your personal experiences. Very appreciated. I think we should have a kava club or something where we can continue this conversation.